Chapter 3. Engines. Knowledge of engines is power. Introduction. Ning, 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 clanked the starter. But my 1963 high school Rambler refused to start. The light turned green. I turned red. A police officer walked up, gazed down over his lowered sunglasses, and said, "What's the matter? Don't you have a color that pleases you?" I continued cranking. Suddenly, white smoke poured from beneath the engine. I thought this had to be the granddaddy of all fires, or perhaps a new pope had just been elected. My car died. Aeroplane engines have been far better to me than car engines. Good thing, given the difficulty of pulling over in the air to take a look under the hood. The modern aeroplane engine is a thing of beauty, not Meryl Streep or Margot Hemingway beauty, you understand, more like Tom Hanks or Robert Redford beauty, rugged, dependable. You, too, will learn to see the beauty in the bag of bolts up in front as it churns away, hour after hour, turning the prop and helping to create lift so that you can fly the friendly skies. Due to the lack of backups for the engine after departing the ground, you will want to do everything possible to take care of the one you have on board. If you're lucky enough to have two engines on board, it still makes pretty good sense to take care of them. The reliability of modern aircraft engines is admirable, given the tremendous stresses and strains to which they are subjected. But don't get overconfident. The loudest sound in the world is an aeroplane engine that quits. At that precise instant, your body releases a jolt of adrenaline sufficient to keep all of New York City awake for a month, and you suddenly remember all the words to Ave Maria, in Latin. A little bit of care goes a long way toward making certain your engine goes a long way. Just as you didn't need a degree in aerodynamics to survive the last chapter, you won't need to demonstrate wrench-twirling skills in order to master this chapter and become a pilot. However, there are things you can and will do in the cockpit which have an effect on the engine longevity and reliability. Besides, if you're going to order the correct maintenance for the workhorse under the cowling, you need to understand some of the basic principles of the internal combustion engine. That's what this chapter is about. The aeroplane engine. The two brothers who made it possible for man to fly, and I don't mean Ernest and Julio Gallo, made history by wedding a relatively lightweight and powerful engine to the Wright Flyer. Modern aeroplane engines are even more impressive in their ability to generate a tremendous amount of power for a given engine weight, as well as for their outstanding reliability. Most general aviation aeroplane engines are of the horizontally opposed variety. Please try and get the term correct. I had a student who spent 6 months laboring under the illusion it was horizontally upholstered. Things went along okay until he called the couch cleaners to do a routine inspection of the engine. In a horizontally opposed engine, the cylinders are placed opposite each other. That's the opposed part. And they work lying down. What a deal. Horizontally opposed cylinder arrangements pack a lot of engine into a small amount of space. Less space used by the engine means less overall drag. Within the engine there are a variety of metallic organs, each of which is vital to the engine's life and thus your life. Every engine contains pistons, cylinders, valves, connecting rods, camshafts, and crankshafts, in varying proportions and arrangements. If you skipped Hot Rod 101 in school and don't know what any of these parts are, don't worry about it. Remember the people in the hardware store, thingamajigs, doohickeys, and gizmos. Because of the reliability of aeroplane engines, you will probably never witness any of these components, individually or collectively, departing your aeroplane. The lost phrase a pilot wants to hear from a passenger is, "Hey, look, there goes one of our pistons." Treated properly, it's unlikely you'll ever have any serious trouble with your aeroplane's engine. Four-cycle engine. Aeroplane engines and humans are similar in how they process their fuel, food. Engines process fuel in a four-step or four-cycle process. Humans do likewise. Humans take in fuel by placing it in their mouths, compress it by chewing, digest it for power, and exhaust the remains. Except that we don't have mufflers. Now that would be a Kodak moment. Aeroplane engines also have four cycles: intake, compression, power, and exhaust. The intake cycle occurs as the piston moves downward. Since the cylinder was filled with the piston as the cycle started, removing it creates a vacuum. Think of it as the presence of nothing, or the absence of everything. Your choice. Nature abhors a vacuum. You've heard that fools rush in where angels fear to tread. While the piston is in its downward journey, the intake valve opens, and a mixture of fuel and air rushes in. As you'll soon see, this sucking action is responsible for the term manifold pressure, which is used on higher performance aeroplanes. The compression cycle occurs when the intake valve closes and the piston rises. The stuff that rushed in probably wouldn't have been in such a rush if it knew that the next thing to happen was the big squeeze. With all the outlets closed, the fuel-air mixture gets compressed. Now comes the big bang. A short chorus of "Come on, baby, light my fire" would be appropriate here. Just before the cylinder hits the top of its return journey, the spark plugs fire. There are 2 plugs in each cylinder for increased safety and efficiency. This sets off a wave of fire which spreads throughout the compressed mixture. The burning mixture pushes the piston downward. This is the power stroke. Once the expanding fuel's energy is absorbed by the piston ascends, expelling exhaust gases from the cylinders through the exhaust valve. This hot act is playing simultaneously on all 4, 6, or 8 cylinders, depending on the engine, though each cylinder is in a different phase of the production at any instant. It all adds up to a horizontal tower of power. The ignition system. I casually mentioned spark plugs a moment ago. We're going to zero in for a closer look at what sparks your engine's fire, because managing that system is crucial to getting the most, or sometimes to getting anything, from the power plant. Once the fuel-air charge is in the cylinders, it must be lit to do any useful work. That's why all powered aircraft have some form of ignition system. Even the space shuttle has one, and I don't think it's some guy with a big lighter. In an internal combustion engine, the ignition system is a one-trick pony. All it does, hour after hour, is send a jolt of electrical energy to the spark plugs so they can spark. Like many specialists, the ignition system is very good at what it does. That's fortunate, because getting the job done right depends on precise timing that makes trapeze artists look klutzy. In order to create a sheet of fire which spreads smoothly across the cylinder, the spark has to light the fuel-air mixture at a precise instant. The cylinder will not sit around waiting. The precise time of this auspicious moment has been worked out by the pocket protector people, and is not your immediate concern. Let's just agree there is a right time. It's not a secret. The correct timing is stated in the engine's service manual, and is often marked on the engine as well. Too early a spark, and the charge starts expanding down while the cylinder is still headed up. Bad. Too late, and some of the energy never gets used. Also bad. Dual ignition systems. A moment ago I said there are 2 spark plugs in each cylinder. This is not solely for the enrichment of the spark plug manufacturers. It's actually for your protection. Modern aeroplanes have dual ignition systems. When dual anythings are put on an aeroplane, it's an engineer's way of saying, "This is really, really important, and I want you to have at least one of these that works at all times, no matter what." That's reason one why you have 2 spark plugs in each barrel. The other reason is that lighting the fire from a couple of spots creates a smoother, more even-spreading flame sphere, which is the goal of the controlled burn we refer to as combustion. Meet Mr. Magneto. Having 2 spark plugs doesn't do an immense amount of good if you hook them up to one source of spark. It's the old thing about the chain and the weakest link. That's why I want you to meet Mr. Magneto, MAG for short. Magnetos contain spinnable magnets housed in metal cases. They are usually located on the rear of the engine. When their internal magnets are spun, they generate electricity for the spark plug. The magneto's electrical output forces electrons to rush to a tiny point on the spark plug. With millions more electrons pushing from behind, like so many kids at a water fountain, each electron is forced to leap from the safety of that point to another spot located across a gap. In leaping the gap, a spark is created. That's why it's called a spark plug. What's particularly interesting about magnetos is that they are self-contained spark generators. They require no outside source of electrical energy to work, other than the turning motion of the aeroplane's engine. That was a very important sentence, in case you were daydreaming. It's important because it tells you the mags will work, even if the alternator or battery is kaput. From time to time, I will let you in on some really fun instructor things, stuff we do that would be banned under the Geneva Convention if it applied to flight instructors.
Dude, check it out. One of the fun things we do is reach across in front of the student pilot in flight and turn off the big red switch. And that he or she has just learned is the electricity on-off gizmo. Whoa. That gets their full attention because they're convinced the lights will go out. They will. And the engine will go off. It won't. Whoa, dude, sweet.
If you have an in-flight problem with your electrical system, alternator or battery failure, for example, you won't need to worry about your engine being affected. In fact, your electrical system could be completely inoperative and the engine would continue to run. A failed electrical system is an annoyance for a VFR pilot. On the other hand, a failed engine is like a dolphin hanging out with tuna, a more risky event. Impulse coupling. The next time a mechanic is hand-pulling a propeller through a couple of revolutions, listen for a clicking sound coming from the engine. The click results from something called an impulse coupling. I know, you thought all couplings were impulse. Well, on some aeroplanes, they are. An impulse coupling does limited duty. It's there to help get the engine all fired up about starting. Then it steps back and waits quietly to be summoned on another flight. When you turn the key in the cockpit, you put the engine's starter to work. The starter is a small, electrically driven motor that sets the engine spinning. You could do the same thing by spinning the propeller, which is the way aeroplanes were started before starters were invented. However, hand-propping an aeroplane is dangerous work, and almost impossible on a large engine. The starter is the little motor that could, except sometimes it can't. It often won't spin the engine quite fast enough to generate sufficient spark from the magnetos to set the fireworks show going. enter the impulse coupling, stage left. The impulse coupling works somewhat like getting a boost over a fence. It's an extra shove that makes the climb easier. Impulse couplings are little springs inside the magneto that save up a slight amount of spin energy on a spring. At a certain point, these springs release their energy, causing the internal magnets to spin at a faster speed. This creates the electrical charge necessary to start the engine without having to equip aeroplanes with more powerful and heavier starters. Once the engine starts, the impulse coupling stops because the engine now generates sufficient speed and spark on its own. Selecting magnetos. From inside the cockpit, you have direct control over the magnetos using the switch. Either the left, the right, or both magnetos can be selected. Normally, we operate with the magnetos in the both position for maximum security and best spark distribution. You wouldn't want to select off in flight because it would kill the engine and attract stares and gasps from your passengers until you turned the mags back on. Is there ever a time in flight when you might want to operate on only one magneto? Yes. Let's assume one magneto went bad in flight. It could randomly misfire, causing a very rough-running engine, despite the other magneto working properly. It could also stop working, the mechanical equivalent of a heart attack. You might try a single magneto and see what happens. Simply switch the mag switch from both to the left mag, then to the right mag. How will you know which is the good or the bad mag? Don't worry, you'll know. You can tell by engine sound and vibration. If the engine sounds like it has lost power and/or runs rough, immediately switch to the other mag position. Operating on one magneto is like operating on one lung. It can be done, but you're bound to experience a decrease in performance. In an airplane engine, this reveals itself as reduced engine RPM. Less spark within the cylinders means the combustion process takes longer. Therefore, the engine speed typically drops around 100 to 150 RPMs, revolutions per minute. We refer to this as a mag drop. No, this isn't where the mag falls off the aeroplane and rolls around on the runway. In many cases, we're concerned not only with the RPM drop on each magneto, but with the difference in RPM between each mag drop. Mag checks are done prior to takeoff in a special place called the run-up area. This difference indicates the degree of timing error between each mag, since each mag is separately timed to the engine. For instance, the pilot's operating handbook for a Cessna 172 Q model indicates that the drop for each mag shouldn't exceed 125 RPM, nor should the difference between the drops be greater than 50 RPM. A larger differential is symptomatic of an ignition system problem. Check your pilot's operating handbook for acceptable drop limits. Many pilots think that the lower the individual mag drop, the better. This isn't necessarily true. Little or no mag drop can mean improper engine timing or a broken P lead. The P lead. Selecting the right or left magneto deactivates the other mag by grounding it to the airframe. This neutralizes the magneto's ability to generate a spark. The absence of a mag drop can mean a mag which is supposed to be grounded, inoperative, isn't. Where that turns into trouble, appropriately enough, is on the ground. The mag is grounded to the airframe via a wire called the P-lead. If the P-lead from a mag is broken or disconnected, it won't be grounded when it should be. including when the aeroplane is shut down. In that state, it is possible for the aeroplane to start, or the engine to at least turn over a bit, if the propeller is turned by hand or accidentally bumped. You will soon learn that the way to properly shut down an engine is not by simply turning the ignition switch to off, but rather by pulling out the mixture control knob. The reason for that, which many pilots don't really know, is it leaves the cylinders without fuel in them and thus minimizes the risk of an inadvertent startup in the event of a bad P-lead.
Several years ago, while delivering propane and propane accessories to the local airport, I saw one of our school's less illustrious rental pilots sitting in the flight lounge with a bright new arm cast. I said, "Skiing accident, Bob?" He yelled, "No, just got my hand caught on the prop." He was moving the propeller by hand, attempting to hook up the airplane's tow bar. The propeller kicked, whirled a half-turn, struck and broke his arm. Of course, he was one of those brag-it-up type of pilots who told everyone else that an old Vietnam War injury was acting up. I happen to know he met his wife during the Vietnam War. She's Canadian.
No matter how the plane is shut down, the prop should always be treated with the utmost respect, just like the family pit bull. It's generally quite tame, but on occasion it can bite. Rod's rule: don't touch the thing if you don't have to. Mechanics and flight instructors sometimes recommend doing a P-lead security check just before shutting down. With the engine idling, quickly turn the mag switch from both to off, then immediately back to both again. If the magnetos are grounding properly, the engine should hesitate as you flick through the off part of the sequence. Engines that keep running as though nothing had happened probably have a magneto that isn't grounding. Then it's time for you to run to the mechanic. Don't touch the propeller, just put the aeroplane away. Walk over to the flight school and use the proper incantation to summon a mechanic from his dark, tool-infested chambers. Let the mechanic handle the problem and the prop. The exhaust system. During the final cycle of a four-stroke engine, a rising piston forces hot gases out an opened exhaust valve and into the exhaust manifold. Most of the time, these gases are released to the atmosphere, but in some instances they are put to productive use by the engine or the aeroplane. When people say they're exhausted, it usually means that they are feeling useless, tired, and worn out, perhaps from using exercise equipment like the Stairmaster. That's why I prefer the Elevator Master. Exhaust gases, though, sometimes have an afterlife. They can be put to use spinning a turbocharger or indirectly heating the carburetor or cabin. Air flowing over the outer shell of the exhaust manifold can be used to raise the temperature of air entering the cabin or carburetor. Buildups of ice within the aeroplane's carburetor are prevented this way. We'll discuss carburetor ice later in this chapter. You simply pull the carburetor heat lever to let heated air into the induction system, which melts ice within the carburetor. Air used to heat the cabin results from the same process. Like carburetor heat, cabin heat is generated by bringing cooler air in contact with a hotter surface of the exhaust manifold. Sometimes exhaust air is used to spin a small turbine. This, in turn, spins a compressor, which sends compressed air to the cylinders. This device is a turbocharger, and it allows flight at higher altitudes by compressing air. Fed compressed air, the engine, which isn't all that smart, thinks it's at or near sea level and puts out full power. This occurs because the presence of more air permits a larger fuel-air charge to be burned. Think of it this way. If you go to the mountains, you will notice very quickly that you can't run, jump, and play without huffing and puffing. The air is less dense. You simply don't have enough oxygen to perform at full capacity. The same is true for a non-turbocharged engine. Less dense air at higher altitudes means decreased performance. Adding a turbocharger is like putting on an oxygen mask when you're in the mountains. Aeroplanes with non-turbocharged engines typically fly at altitudes below 15,000 feet, MSL, mean sea level. On the other hand, aeroplanes with turbochargers can fly at altitudes up to 25,000 feet, MSL. Higher altitudes have other advantages. It's often possible to catch stronger winds, and if they're blowing your way, this cuts travel time and fuel consumption. The induction system.
Well, let's see now. I remember Rod had a student who apparently forgotten to register for the military draft. When Rod mentioned the induction system, the student shot out the door, leaving only a plume of smoking shoe tread. I guess that punk didn't feel lucky.
To avoid problems, let me be specific. We're talking here about the aeroplane's induction system, which is the route by which fuel and air are absorbed for engine operations. The air filter, carburetor, and intake manifold, pipes connected to each cylinder, make up the induction system on carburetor-equipped aeroplanes. Later on in this chapter, we'll examine the induction system for aeroplanes with fuel injection. Let's start by examining an important part of the induction system known as the carburetor. The carburetor.
At a fancy party, I once asked the bartender if he knew how to mix up a grasshopper, the name of a drink. He said, well, you put a little blindfold on him and spin him around 5 or 6 times. Seems the bartender was good at mixing up answers as the carburetor was at mixing up fuel and air. In fact, that's exactly what the carburetor is designed to do.
A carburetor is the ultimate mixmaster. Its job is to mix fuel and air in the right proportion for ideal combustion. Too much fuel or too little air, and things won't go boom in the cylinder as they should. Since the fuel-air charge goes from the carburetor to cylinder, you can think of this as the shake-and-bake system. The carburetor is one of the aeroplane's most important devices. You must understand its strengths and weaknesses, lest you become totally useless, kind of like a cabin attendant for a cargo airline, in the face of an engine problem. Float-type carburetor. Have you ever looked in the tank of a toilet? It's the place where you're supposed to keep the brick if you want to conserve water, not in the bowl. Perhaps you've noticed a float on a lever that was capable of upward and downward movement within the tank. A similar float arm, not as big of course, is found in the float chamber of the carburetor. As the toilet's tank loses water, the float lowers and opens a valve which lets water in to replenish the loss. As the tank fills, the float rises, shutting off the valve which restricts incoming water. In this way, the water level is maintained at some desired level. Carburetors have similar mechanisms. A rising or lowering float in the float chamber regulates fuel entering from the intake line. Of course, float systems, like toilets, only work when they're right side up, not inverted. While I doubt you'll ever be piloting an inverted toilet, it's possible to pilot an inverted aeroplane. Fortunately, some aircraft have an inverted carburetor system, which allows them to operate in an aerobatic mode. These aircraft, can sustain inverted flight without having the engine quit. Workings of the float-type carburetor. Carburetors are often located in line directly behind the air filter at the front of the airplane. Air flows through the air filter into the carburetor, then upwards into the individual cylinders via the induction manifold. Airplane carburetors located underneath the engine are called updraft-type carburetors because air and fuel must be drawn upward toward each cylinder. You'll find out in a moment why it's important to know what type of carburation system you have on your aeroplane. Air is drawn upward into the carburetor's throat and passes over a restriction, otherwise known as a venturi. The cross-section of the venturi is very similar in shape to the cross-section of an airplane's wing. Air velocity increases over the venturi as it does when it flows over a wing. Like an airplane's wing with high-velocity air over the top, pressure decreases according to Bernoulli's principle. A reduction in pressure occurs near the outlet of the main discharge nozzle, located in the middle of the venturi. Fuel in the float chamber is under normal atmospheric pressure, while at the tip or outlet of the main discharge nozzle is at a lower pressure. Fuel flows from high pressure to low pressure as it's drawn upward into the carburetor's throat towards the cylinders. As I mentioned earlier, air is drawn into the induction system by the sucking action of downward moving pistons. This is similar to how air is drawn into our lungs. Our chest muscles expand, expanding the lungs, creating a suction which pulls in air. If something is caught in our breathing passages, we're unable to inhale, we choke. Fortunately, we have the Heimlich maneuver to clear obstructions from blocked breathing passages. That's not the Heineken maneuver, so don't leave for a beer when someone's choking. Were it not for some restriction placed in the carburetor's throat, the engine would draw in maximum fuel and air and run at full power when started. Wouldn't that be interesting? You'd turn the key, crank the starter, pop a wheelie and take off. Air traffic controllers would love you. Fortunately, there is a device that restricts airflow in the throat of the carburetor. It's called the throttle valve, or throttle butterfly valve. The throttle valve is connected directly to the throttle lever located in the cockpit. Moving the throttle forward or aft opens or closes the throttle valve, controlling the amount of air entering the carburetor. When the throttle is fully opened, the throttle valve is parallel to the intake airflow. In other words, the valve offers no restriction to the engine suction. The engine draws in enormous amounts of fuel and air and runs at full power. A closed throttle moves the throttle valve perpendicular to the carburetor's airflow. Downward moving pistons are causing tremendous suction, but only a small amount of air and fuel gets past the closed throttle valve, just enough to let the engine idle. That's why the engine doesn't quit when you pull the throttle all the way back. A fellow pilot had his mother in the airplane and pulled the throttle to its idle position. The engine sound decreased as expected, but the engine still idled. She looked over at him and said, "Hey, turn that thing back on right now, mister." Moms, don't you love them? The idling system. If the throttle valve completely restricted air from entering the carburetor, the engine would quit when the throttle was closed. Fortunately, a small amount of fuel and air flows past the closed throttle valve. It's the idling jet that allows this to happen. An idling jet is not a 747 sitting around waiting for permission to take off. It's more like a deliberate leak. The reduction in pressure downstream of the throttle valve continues to draw a small amount of fuel into the cylinders through the idling jet. Since there is a rather inefficient mixing of air and fuel when the engine is idling for long periods, it's not unusual for spark plugs to foul and the engine to run rough rather than purr. If you're going to be operating the engine in the idle position for long periods of time, you might want to occasionally clear the engine with short applications of power. How often? Often enough to keep the engine from loading up. Experience will tell you how often to do this with your airplane. The accelerator pump. Surely you've had the experience of being so thirsty that you gulped down a soda pop and proceeded to choke yourself in the process. Engines aren't much different. They can choke themselves if they try to gulp air too quickly. When the throttle is opened quickly, the vacuum created by the pistons could gulp large amounts of air, too much for a given amount of fuel. The initial rush of air over the venturi is so quick that fuel can't be sucked through the nozzle of the metering jet fast enough, and the result would be a sudden hesitation in the development of engine power with rapid throttle application. That's something that will test your triple bypass. Fortunately, carburetor engineers solved this problem with something known as an accelerator pump, a small plunger-type mechanism linked to the throttle within the carburetor. When the throttle is opened quickly, it pushes the plunger downward, forcing an extra shot of fuel from the metering jet into the carburetor's throat. This compensates for the sudden inrush of air that accompanies quick throttle application and provides for a smooth, continuous increase in RPM. Opening the throttle slowly allows fuel to slip around the sides of the small plunger, preventing an extra injection of fuel into the carburetor. For your information, most but not all carburetors have some type of accelerator pump. Assuming the airplane has an updraft carburetor with an accelerator pump, what happens when the engine isn't running and the throttle is pumped? Yes, the accelerator pump squirts fuel into the carburetor. Without the engine running, there's no suction to inhale the fuel into the cylinders, and fuel can fall to the bottom of the carburetor, soaking the air filter. Should the engine backfire during startup, your expensive airplane becomes a barbecue. If you see people running toward you with hot dogs and buns, it may be a sign of the prime. To avoid throwing an unscheduled barbecue event, it's best not to prime the engine by pumping the throttle on an engine with an updraft carburetor. If you insist on priming with the throttle, wait till the starter turns the engine, then pump the throttle. Any fuel squirted in the carburetor is more likely to be drawn upward into the cylinder. It's always safer, though, to use the engine primer. That's what it's intended for. Besides, it gives you an extra thing to touch during engine start, and this always impresses the passengers, especially if you mention phrases like, "Roger, Houston, we have T-4 and counting, and are a go for space, Doc." Atomization of fuel. An atom is a very small particle of matter, about as small as the runway appeared during your first solo landing. Carburetors earn their keep by breaking up fuel into millions of tiny, atom-like droplets and mixing them with air. This process is called atomization, and it makes the fuel-air mixture highly combustible, provided the fuel and air are mixed in the proper proportions. The proportions or ratios of fuel to air must fall within certain limits for efficient combustion. The fuel-air ratio is simply the ratio of the weight of fuel to the weight of the air entering the engine. Fuel-air ratios of approximately 1 part fuel to 13 parts of air are the most efficient for combustion. This particular ratio produces a highly powerful mixture within the cylinders. Combustion can occur with fuel-air ratios of 1 to 8 all the way up to 1 to 20. Too little fuel, 1 to 20 fuel-air ratio, means there isn't enough fuel to cause a useful burn in the cylinders. Too much fuel, 1 to 8 fuel-air ratio, means there is not enough air within the cylinders to efficiently burn the fuel that's available. Most flight instructor cars operate at a 1 to 8 ratio. This allows students to keep an eye on their instructor's whereabouts by tracking the car's dark exhaust clouds on a satellite map. If aeroplanes operated at one altitude, where air density never changes, you wouldn't need to worry about manually changing your fuel-air ratio. Not many pilots fly at only one altitude, which means you need to know how to use the mixture control to maintain a specific fuel-air ratio. Your carburetor, the ice maker. Carburetors are great at atomizing fuel and mixing it with air. An interesting side effect of that process is that temperatures drop downstream of the main discharge nozzle. Temperature drops of as much as 70 degrees Fahrenheit within the carburetor's throat are not uncommon. Similar temperature drops are experienced in airline cabins when brand new flight engineers are manipulating the air conditioning controls. Do you remember the last time you spilled a little fuel on your finger? It evaporated quickly, didn't it? It also got a little chilly down there, didn't it? The process of evaporation requires heat. That's why you feel cooler when you sweat, and the sweat evaporates, and why you feel miserable if you sweat and the humidity is high enough so that there isn't much evaporation. Your carburetor is a fine ice maker. Because of the considerable drop in temperature caused by the atomization and evaporation of fuel, any moisture present can and will freeze. With ice stuck in its throat, your carburetor and thus your engine can't breathe. Carburetor ice can occur at any temp. It's one of those gorgeous flying days, bright, beautiful, maybe 80 degrees Fahrenheit outside. You're flying along without a care on your mind, and certainly no thought of ice. Think again. A temperature drop of 70 degrees Fahrenheit means that if the outside air temperature is 80 degrees Fahrenheit, then the temperature in the throat of the carburetor can be 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That's way below freezing. Be prepared for carburetor ice to form at almost any outside air temperature, though it's most likely to occur between outside temperatures of 20 degrees Fahrenheit to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Soon you'll see how we can rid the carburetor of ice, should it form. Ice, just your type. Induction system ice comes in 3 varieties: impact ice, fuel ice, and throttle ice. Impact ice. Impact ice occurs when visible moisture is present and the outside air temperature, OAT, is at or below freezing. Pilot term. Visible moisture is water that can be seen, such as rain or a cloud. Moisture can freeze over the induction system's air filter or inlet port and restrict incoming air. This deprives the engine of air and results in the engine taking a nap, unless something is done to correct the problem. Impact ice is usually the instrument pilot's dilemma because he or she is licensed to operate in the clouds, i.e., visible moisture. It is possible, though, to have an air filter freeze over while nowhere near a cloud. If the air is moist and temperatures are low, water can accumulate on the air filter's membrane and freeze. This restricts the filter's ability to pass air onto the carburetor, resulting in a loss of power. While not one of the more extreme forms of impact ice, it is serious nevertheless. Another occasion where a serious type of impact ice is likely is during freezing rain. For now, just know that if your air filter ever becomes clogged by impact ice, you have a remedy at hand. It's called the carburetor heat control. When you pull this lever, air that is not passed through the air filter goes to the heating shroud around the exhaust manifold, and then on to the carb and engine. It's like having an emergency nose through which your airplane can breathe. Airplanes having fuel injection, we'll discuss this shortly, have something known as an alternate air lever or an automatic alternate air door, which provides the same breathing redundancy for the engine. Fuel ice. Fuel ice and throttle ice, unlike impact ice, are both types of carburetor icing. Fuel ice is an internal problem rather than an external one. Fuel ice forms downstream of the main discharge nozzle. The expanding fuel-air mixture cools the airstream in much the same way underarm spray deodorant cools you. It's not unusual to apply a spray of deodorant and find yourself physically airborne, shocked by the large glacier that just formed under your arm. If the carburetor's internal temperature drops below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, airborne moisture freezes, causing a restriction to incoming air. Once again, the engine can't breathe, which results in reduced engine power. Fuel ice can occur at outside air temperatures as high as 85 degrees Fahrenheit and at humidities as low as 50%. It is, however, more likely to form at temperatures between 20 degrees Fahrenheit and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, under high humidity conditions. Carburetor ice is unpredictable. From practical experience, I will tell you that fuel ice as well as throttle ice can form at almost any outside air temperature and humidity. Throttle ice. Throttle ice forms on the rear side of the throttle valve. It is more likely to occur when the throttle is in a partially closed position. When the throttle is partially closed, air curves and bends around this valve in much the same way it bends across a wing. Bernoulli's principle is once again invoked. Air accelerates around this valve and pressure lowers. A reduction in pressure causes a decrease in air temperature, resulting in airborne moisture freezing on the back side of the throttle valve. Given enough airborne moisture and proper conditions, throttle ice can also prevent an engine from breathing, unless something is done to remove or prevent it. It has been said that one day the cats and the birds will lie down together. I believe this is true if you have enough birds. Mixing cats and birds presents a significant hazard to the birds. Moisture in carburetors present a similar hazard to those not aware of icing problems. Smart pilots learn to anticipate carburetor ice during flight. We'll discuss the warning signs of carb ice in a moment. Regardless of your power setting or flight condition, you are not immune to carb ice. Remember, let's get the finger back in your ear, visible moisture in the form of clouds or rain need not be present for fuel and throttle ice to occur. The ice eater. The carburetor heater. The antidote for carburetor ice is carburetor heat. Inside the airplane, we have a carburetor heat lever. Pulling this lever allows heated air to enter the carburetor, raising the air temperature within its throat as much as 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Provided you use it early enough, carburetor heat will quickly melt the ice and/or prevent further ice formation. Heated air is obtained for the carburetor by passing air over the exhaust manifold, then piping it directly into the carburetor. This air is, as we've already mentioned, unfiltered. That's why you reach for this lever if the air filter is iced over. However, it's the reason you do not want to use carburetor heat for long periods of time while on the ground. Damaging dust and dirt particles can be drawn into the engine. Carb ice symptoms. Carburetor heat should be used whenever you suspect ice formation. The best clue to the presence of carburetor ice on fixed-pitch propeller aeroplanes is an uncommanded decrease in engine RPM. Engine roughness is another sign of carburetor ice. Whenever engine power unexpectedly decreases, suspect the presence of carburetor ice and apply full carburetor heat. Let's suppose you're cruising along in your Cessna 172 and notice a slow but consistent RPM drop of 200 RPM over a period of 15 seconds. Suspecting carburetor ice, you immediately apply full carburetor heat. Some pilots' operating handbooks recommend that full throttle be applied first, then carburetor heat. There's a very good reason for this. First, for carburetor heat to be effective, the engine must be producing a certain amount of power. After all, heat comes from the hot exhaust system. Full throttle ensures adequate heat production is available to melt the ice. Second, applying full throttle lets more air into the carburetor. This is certainly a good thing, since it's restricted airflow that's causing the problem. As you apply carburetor heat, the RPM decreases another 300 RPM, and you're looking around to see if the plane has parachutes available. Stay cool as a carb. You have not done the wrong thing, and in a few seconds things should get better, honest. As we've previously seen, heated air is less dense than cooler air. Unleashing carb heat results in an RPM drop. In fact, that's how you test to make certain the carb heat is working before leaving the ground. More on this shortly. If there is ice present, it will melt and RPM will rise. In fact, the increase in RPM after an initial drop is a sure indication that you had carburetor ice. When the ice is melted, the rise in RPM ceases. As the carb heat is turned off, the RPM rises again to its previous pre-ice level. When you apply carb heat, the engine may cough a couple of times as it digests chunks of melting ice from along the throttle valve or throat. Try not to worry. Easy for me to say. The engine isn't going to quit because it ingested a little water and ice under these conditions. Nevertheless, a rough-running engine always makes me feel on edge, like a dog wearing contact lenses with small cats painted on them. Carburetor heat is actually a de-icing device. You apply full carburetor heat when you suspect ice is present. Once the ice melts, you turn the heat off. Seems simple. Should the Iceman cometh again, just reach for that trusty lever. Using carb heat does not hurt the engine in any way. Lycoming, a major engine manufacturer, says, and I quote, "At cruise power, even with full heat, we have never experienced detonation or damage to the engine." End quote. To be on the safe side, always check the pilot's operating handbook or the engine manufacturer's handbook for your airplane to make sure they offer similar advice. After a few dozen cycles of yank out, push in, you will either get tired or bored. Thoughts will enter your mind. One of them will be, "Gee, I wonder what happens if I just leave the carb heat on." Be my guest. Keeping the carb heat on makes it too hot inside the carburetor for ice to form. Used this way, carburetor heat is an anti-icing device. Keep in mind that the mixture becomes richer when carburetor heat is applied. You'll need to re-lean the mixture with the application of continuous carburetor heat. Because of the reduced density of the air entering the engine, you should expect a 10% to 15% reduction in power with application of full heat. That's the downside to using continuous carb heat. Apply carb heat as a precautionary measure. Carburetor heat should be used as a precautionary measure when making descents at reduced power. Reduced power means a closed throttle and a greater chance of throttle ice. I recommend that carb heat be applied fully when on final approach to land or when descending into the traffic pattern. Check your pilot's operating handbook for specific recommendations on when to use carburetor heat. If your aeroplane is equipped with a carburetor air temperature gauge, you'll have an even easier time anticipating the presence of carburetor ice. This gauge identifies those critical carburetor temperatures, identified by a yellow-colored arc, conducive to the formation of carburetor ice. Applying enough carburetor heat to keep the needle out of the critical range should keep ice from forming. Carburetor icing potential in different engines. All engines are not created equal, at least when it comes to carb ice. Some engine makes and models are more susceptible to carburetor ice than others. This doesn't make them unsafe, any more than singing Gregorian chants makes you a Gregorian. You simply need to be aware of the icing potential of different engine models. For example, the induction system on some airplane engines makes them a little more resistant to carburetor ice. Lycoming engines with carburetors have their carburetor bolted to the bottom of the oil pan. An opening in the bottom of the oil pan is part of the induction system through which incoming air is warmed by the oil's radiant heat. The carburetor is also heated by conduction, touching, from the hot oil pan. This lessens the likelihood that the carburetor will develop ice as easily as carburetors on other makes of engines.
Frankly, it doesn't matter which engine your airplane has, as long as you know what to do if carburetor ice appears. Don't be like those pilots who think they'll never get carburetor ice. You can tell who they are. They're the ones that drive through the hamburger stand and nod at the speakers. This doesn't bode well for humanity.
Fuel, going with the flow. The mixture control. The aeroplane's mixture control, the red knob with thorns along its side, allows you to keep the aeroplane operating at a proper fuel-air ratio as air density changes with altitude. Pulling out, toward you, on the mixture control decreases the amount of fuel for a given amount of air entering the engine. This process is called leaning. Leaning is not where student pilots lean to the right or left during a turn. For now, just understand that leaning is accomplished by restricting the flow of fuel through the main metering jet. Pulling the mixture control out to its maximum rearward position of travel activates something known as idle cutoff. This kills the engine by restricting the fuel leaving the carburetor. Of course, we typically pull the mixture to the idle cutoff position when stopping the engine on the ground at the end of the flight. Be careful about mistaking the mixture control for the throttle. It happens on some planes, especially older ones, the two knobs are not very distinct, and many a pilot has throttled back with the mixture control, producing the sounds of silence. At this point, your instructor starts making a lot of unusual noises. Anytime the manufacturer paints something red and places symbolic thorns on its handle, I'd say they were trying to tell us something. Look or feel before you pull on a cockpit lever. The fuel-air mixture. With an increase in altitude, the air becomes thinner and doesn't weigh as much for a given volume. The problem is that the amount of fuel flowing through the carburetor is regulated by the volume, not the weight, of the air passing over the venturi. Think about it this way. During the intake cycle, the pistons move downward, drawing air into the cylinders. The space within the cylinders is constant. The volume of air drawn into the cylinders is the same at sea level as it is at 10,000 feet MSL. Since similar volumes flow through the venturi, the carburetor wants to send the cylinders the same amount of fuel at 10,000 feet MSL as it does at sea level. This presents a problem, since air has fewer molecules for a given volume at 10,000 feet MSL. In other words, the air at 10,000 feet weighs less, fewer molecules, for a given volume than the air at sea level. To maintain the same fuel-air ratio at higher altitudes or in less dense air, we must manually adjust the amount of fuel leaving the carburetor. When to lean. Most engine manufacturers recommend leaning the mixture whenever you're operating at or below 75% of the engine's maximum power output. Be sure and check your pilot's operating handbook to be sure. The reason for this magic dividing line is that above 75% power, engines need all the cooling help they can get, and we'll see in our discussion on EGT, exhaust gas temperature gauges, adding fuel helps cool the engine. At power levels above 75%, the mixture should be in the full rich position. But how do you know when you're operating at power levels greater than 75%? A few assumptions are necessary here. First, as the aeroplane ascends, a non-turbocharged engine produces less power, since there is less air to aid in the combustion process. If the airplane is operating with full throttle at less than 5,000 feet MSL, there's a good chance the engine is producing more than 75% of its maximum power output. Don't lean under these conditions. In other words, if you're climbing with full throttle at less than 5,000 feet MSL, the mixture should be full forward. Above 5,000 feet, where the engine probably produces less than 75% of its maximum power, even with full throttle, you should lean the mixture for either best economy or best power. As a rule of thumb, aviation is all thumbs and relies on a lot of such rules, readjust the mixture every 1,000 feet of altitude change. The 5,000-foot MSL recommendation is actually for a density altitude of 5,000 feet. We'll cover density altitude in Chapter 5. For now, 5,000 feet is accurate enough. Since most cruising is done at 55 to 65% power, you should always lean the engine regardless of your altitude at these power settings. Check the pilot's operating handbook if you're not sure about the engine's power output for a given altitude and power setting. I'll show you how to do this in the performance chapter. Remember, failure to lean appropriately means you'll use up an extra portion of fuel unnecessarily. It's important to note that some airplanes have pressure-type carburetors or altitude-compensating carburetors, which automatically make mixture adjustments with changes in air density. That is why you may not see a mixture control in some airplanes. How to lean.
When Marge asks you how you lean an airplane, don't say, with the ailerons or put it on a diet. Don't! You lean an airplane with the mixture control. There are a couple of ways to accomplish this, so let's take a look at them.
Airplanes with fixed-pitch propellers, propellers having one pitch that can't be changed in flight, and float-type carburetors can be leaned using the tachometer. Simply ease the mixture control out slowly while watching the engine RPM change. As the mixture approaches the fuel-air ratio for best power, the RPM will increase. An increase in RPM means the engine is using fuel more efficiently and is developing more power. When the RPM peaks, you are at the fuel-air ratio, which produces maximum power for a given air density and throttle setting. This is known as leaning the mixture for best power. Further pulling of the mixture will cause engine roughness and reduce RPM from over-leaning. If you feel the engine running rough during the leaning process, enrich the mixture slightly until the engine smooths out. Sometimes airplanes are equipped with fuel flow gauges and/or exhaust gas temperature (EGT) gauges. With a fuel flow gauge, you can set the manufacturer's recommended fuel flow rate for a given power condition. This is an approximate way of leaning the mixture for proper operation. Unfortunately, fuel flow gauges are often not accurate enough for precise leaning. Use of the EGT gauge offers a relatively precise means for leaning the engine. Too rich and too lean. Aside from inefficient fuel combustion, mixtures that are too rich or too lean cause difficulties with engine operation. A mixture that is too rich causes engine roughness. Spark plugs are easily fouled when unburned fuel residue builds up between the plug gap. Lead, a component of high-octane fuel, can also build up on a spark plug, exacerbating the fouling process. A fouled spark plug, or plugs, can result in a rough and inefficient running engine. It's interesting to note that a fouled spark plug in flight can be detected by an increase in EGT. Why? With only one flame source operating within the cylinder, it takes longer to reach the maximum combustion temperature of the cylinder's fuel charge. It simply burns slower. As a result, the mixture is hotter as it exits the exhaust valve, resulting in a higher EGT. Aside from a rough-running engine, an excessively rich mixture contributes to high fuel consumption. This means you'll have less range, less endurance, and smaller fuel reserves. In fact, some estimates show operating at full rich mixture instead of best economy setting can increase fuel consumption by as much as 70%, depending on the airplane, altitude, and other variables. Even smaller percentages are significant. Do make it a point to lean properly. A mixture that's too lean produces other problems. First, too lean a mixture means less power is produced. Small airplanes are anything but overpowered. We often need to use every one of those horses under the cowling. This is especially true when flying at high altitudes, where non-turbocharged piston engine airplanes don't perform very efficiently in the first place. The biggest danger with an excessively lean mixture is that it burns hot. It does so because it burns slower. This exposes the cylinder, piston, and valves to higher temperatures, and high temperature is the worst enemy of metal, causing reduced cylinder life and other problems that can blow a hole in your pocketbook. High cylinder temperatures also lead to something known as detonation. Instead of a smooth, even expansion of the fuel-air charge within the cylinder, the mixture detonates, explodes, causing damage to the engine. For more information about detonation, see Post-Flight Briefing number 3-1. Leaning and high-altitude takeoffs for non-turbocharged airplanes. Takeoffs are normally made with a full rich mixture. Aviation, of course, is comprised of exceptions to most rules. One of those exceptions is high altitudes, which you can generally take to mean any airport above 5,000 feet, MSL. It often puzzles students, but the fact is the airplane doesn't know it's on the ground. Honest. To an airplane, 5,000 feet is 5,000 feet, at least from an engine performance point of view. Remembering that the rule is to lean above 5,000 feet, you now know there's something that needs to be done before takeoff. How should you lean the mixture? During the run-up, that's a pre-flight check of the aeroplane engine, hold the brakes, apply full throttle, lean the mixture, then return the throttle to its idle position. Make sure no one behind you will be affected by the propeller blast. This procedure can also be done while holding a position on the runway prior to taking off. This is the best way to do it as long as there are no other airplanes on final approach to land. Takeoff should be made at this mixture setting to ensure maximum climb performance. Leaning prior to departure is also a good idea when departing an airport, regardless of the elevation, where high temperature conditions decrease the air's density. Under certain conditions, if the outside air temperature is quite high, an airport at 2,000 feet MSL can have air with the same density as an airport at 6,000 feet MSL. Attempting to depart with a full rich mixture under these conditions produces the same decrease in performance as departing a high-altitude airport. The fuel system. Unlike solids, liquids present problems in three areas: selection, availability, and contamination. Knowing how to select the proper fuel, ensuring its availability for use by the engine, and preventing contamination is part of every pilot's job. Components. As pointed out in Chapter 1, aeroplane fuel is stored in fuel tanks that are normally located in the wings. Two of the most common types of fuel tanks are the wet wing and the bladder type. A wet wing tank is simply an internal portion of the wing that is sealed to hold fuel. Bladder tanks are sealed rubber containers resting inside the wings as separate units. Fuel tanks serve the important purpose of transporting food for the engine. Unfortunately, engine food as well as human food can be contaminated. Neither you nor your engine should consume anything that's contaminated. I just read where they now have non-toxic Crayola crayons, which makes me wonder just what I was eating as a kid. Water is the most frequent contaminant found in fuel. Water, weighing approximately 8 pounds per gallon, is heavier than fuel, which weighs approximately 6 pounds per gallon. If it's present, water rests on the bottom of fuel tanks, where it's the first thing to go to the engine. Since there are no engines which run on water, or walk on it either, this presents a significant challenge. One of the ways pilots try to avoid water contamination is by filling their fuel tanks after the last flight of the day. Air usually contains moisture, sometimes a lot of moisture. When cooled, that moisture condenses, just as it does on the outside of a cold glass on a warm summer's day. Once it has been wrung out of the air, that water waddles down to the bottom of the fuel tank. By filling the tanks, you force most of the air and its moisture out. Fuel tanks have sump drains at the lowest part of the tank. These drains allow you to remove the impurities that have found their way into the fuel system. Make sure to drain the sumps during each pre-flight. The sumps should also be drained after every refueling. You never know where that gas truck has been. Sump draining isn't difficult at all. Simply take your draining device, usually a clear plastic container with a slim probe in the middle, and push it up inside the sump drain. This lets a small amount of fuel flow downward into the plastic drain, and sometimes onto your hand, down your arm, and onto your shirt as well. Take a small sample, then remove the draining device. Make sure the drain is completely closed. Then inspect the sample. Check for water in the bottom of the container first. Then look for any impurities that may signal internal tank corrosion. Water is usually easy to identify since it visually contrasts with fuel, which comes in a variety of designer colors. I'll explain about those in a second. If you do strike water, don't throw your arms up and shout, "I found it." People won't have the slightest idea what you're talking about, and you don't want them guessing about a statement like that. Just keep on draining until you get only fuel. If there's a lot of water, prudence dictates finding out why before setting forth into the sky. On some airplanes, particularly high-wing aircraft with bladder-type fuel cells, it's necessary to shake the wings and lower the tail in order to chase water from its hiding place among the folds of the rubber bladder. What does it mean if you drain a sample from the fuel tank and it's perfectly clear? It probably means one of two things. You have either water or kerosene, jet fuel, in your tank. How would you know which one it is? The answer is to smell it. A little whiff of gas or kerosene isn't going to hurt you, unless you make it your job to whiff at all the airplanes at the airport. Kerosene has a distinctly oily smell to it. It's also oily to the touch compared to aviation gasoline. Fuel colors.
Bobby, your fuel is dyed. Not dead, dyed. And for a very good reason. Different grades of aviation fuel, called avgas, are dyed for easy identification.
Red-colored fuel is of the 80-octane variety, very hard to find nowadays. Blue fuel is of the 100 LL or low-lead variety and is one of the most common aviation fuels in use today. Green fuel is 100 octane and is also very hard to find. I haven't seen it in years, not even on St. Patrick's Day. Jet fuel or kerosene is clear-colored and must not be used in piston-powered aeroplanes. It's important to use only the proper grade of fuel for your aeroplane. Using a lower grade can cause serious problems such as detonation. Higher grades can foul plugs. However, if faced with a choice of using a lower or a higher grade of fuel, choose the higher grade for temporary operations. Under no circumstances, however, should you use jet fuel in your piston-powered airplane. Believe me when I say it won't make you go as fast as a jet. In fact, it won't make you go at all. Jet fuel doesn't work in these engines.
One last word on fuel. Don't use automobile gasoline in your airplane unless specific approval in the form of a Supplemental Type Certificate, STC, has been issued to you for your aircraft.
An STC represents FAA permission for a modification to the original configuration or operating parameters of the airplane. It is granted after extensive testing and documentation, and frequently includes very specific instructions which must be followed. This is particularly true in the case of auto fuel. Unless your engine is specifically approved for automobile gasoline, it has not been tested and found safe for your specific engine.
Using it would both be illegal and foolish, since you would be anointing yourself a test pilot, and those guys don't live very long.
Fuel vents. If you've ever tried to suck milk out of one side of a carton without poking a hole in the other, you'll understand why fuel tanks are vented. As the fuel pump sucks fuel from the tank, air must replace the departing fuel or a vacuum forms. If that happens, fuel starvation isn't far behind, since at some point the pump can't overcome the vacuum. Some gas caps are vented, allowing small amounts of air to replace consumed fuel. Fuel tanks can also be vented by small tubes. It's always a good practice to make sure these vent lines are unobstructed. Sometimes you can see fuel overflowing from them on hot days when the tanks are filled. This occurs because air in the tanks expands slightly as the airplane sits in the sun and warms. This is a good sign the tubes are free of obstructions. Auxiliary fuel pumps. High-wing airplanes have gravity-fed fuel systems. Nevertheless, these aircraft, like all modern airplanes, still have mechanical fuel pumps to keep fuel within the system under pressure. Low-wing airplanes, on the other hand, can't be gravity-fed because the fuel tanks are located below engine level. These aircraft have auxiliary fuel pumps, sometimes called boost pumps, to maintain fuel pressure in the event of a mechanical pump failure. While low-wing airplanes are equipped with boost pumps as a matter of necessity, high-wing airplanes can have them too. Airplanes like the Cessna 210 with fuel injection have a boost pump to aid in starting as well as in emergencies. Boost pumps are often used during engine start to pressurize the fuel system. This helps purge air trapped within the fuel lines. After the engine starts, the electric boost pump is turned off to see if the mechanical pump is operational and is pressurizing the system. Monitored by a fuel pressure gauge on the instrument panel, fuel pressure can be examined at any time by the pilot. Most manufacturers of low-wing airplanes recommend the boost pump be turned on for takeoff until the airplane is at least 1,000 feet above the ground. They similarly recommend it be turned on during descents when the airplane is within 1,000 feet of the surface. Follow the specific recommendations in your pilot's operating handbook. A failure of the engine's mechanical fuel pump at lower altitudes is especially critical in low-wing aeroplanes, since gravity won't feed the system. It's also a good idea to activate the boost pump when switching fuel tanks. This helps pressurize the fuel system and purge any air that may have slipped into the fuel lines. Some airplanes have both high and low boost pump settings. Normally, low boost pump settings are used for engine start and takeoff. High boost pump settings can be used to stabilize fluctuating fuel flow indications during a high-altitude, hot day takeoff where vapor lock is a threat. This setting may also be used to help purge air that has entered the fuel lines. This may result from running a fuel tank dry. Not a good idea. Be careful. Under some conditions, you can easily flood an engine in flight with a high boost pump setting. This could cause a temporary or complete loss of engine power. Study the recommendations in your pilot's operating handbook regarding the proper procedures for your particular airplane. Prime time. Remember how we shut the engine off by pulling back the mixture control, thus burning off the last of the fuel in the cylinders? Great. Now it comes time to crank the cranky thing over. Where is the fuel supposed to come from to get started? It's time to prime. Priming is sort of like tipping the maitre d' a few bucks on a crowded night when you don't have reservations. It just sort of helps get things going in your favor. Most aeroplane engines can be primed through the use of a small plunger-like device called the primer, which is located in the cockpit. The primer usually squirts fuel in the upper portions of the induction system, bypassing the carburetor completely. This is especially useful for startups on cold days when fuel and air are disinclined to mix. Once you're done with prime time, make sure the primer is locked back in place. This generally takes a slight turn of the lever after it's pushed all the way in. An unlocked primer can allow fuel leakage into the induction system, making for an extra rich fuel-air mixture. Fuel gauges. I want you to trust your airplane, your spouse, and your accountant. I want you to never, ever trust your fuel gauge. For a variety of reasons, airplane fuel gauges are notoriously unreliable. They couple outmoded technology to demanding conditions. Electric float-type fuel measuring systems use 1930s technology to measure fuel quantity. The result is somewhat less believable than a tarot card reading. Unfortunately, lulled by their experience with car gauges, which are generally pretty accurate, many pilots think that what they see is what they can get. Every year, there are dozens of fuel exhaustion accidents in which people are needlessly endangered.
Fuel exhaustion is the term generally applied to what normal people think of as screwing up and running out of gas. I always thought fuel exhaustion was an interesting term. It makes it sound as though the gas just sort of got tired and fell asleep.
Try and keep in mind that the regulations require fuel gauges to be accurate in only two conditions: when the tank is full and when it's empty, no usable fuel on board. There are more accurate measuring systems available, but they are also more expensive and thus confined for the most part to larger airplanes. So what's the solution? Finger and ear, please. Never ever leave the ground without looking for yourself to verify what's in the tanks, and always know how much fuel you will burn per hour of operation. Fuel level determination is absolutely, positively, a do-it-yourself task. Don't take anyone's word for how full the tanks are. Find out for yourself. I recommend using a calibrated dipstick measuring device to plumb the fuel level. Make sure the dipstick is calibrated for your airplane. You can purchase specific dipsticks for individual makes and models of airplane.
Be careful about making your own dipstick. One of Rod's students made his own and calibrated it by progressively filling the tank and marking measurements on the stick. The only thing the student didn't do was put a big enough lip on the end, so, while plumbing the fuel, it escaped his grasp and fell into the tank. The student stared into the tank for 10 minutes in total disbelief. Imagine that. Dipsticks don't swim. Our local mechanic had to remove it before they could fly.
How much is enough? Everybody has their own idea on how much fuel is enough to carry. I'll share mine. Personally, I never operate an airplane with less than a quarter of its total fuel capacity. At the 1/4 mark, it's time to land and tanker up. You will, until they invent mid-air refueling for small airplanes, have to land. This seems to be one of the reasons some pilots are reluctant to get fuel. Landing takes time and effort. It becomes easy to push on because you know you've got enough fuel to make it to your destination. Pretty much, sort of. Usually you will, too. Usually. But one time the weather gets bad or the airport is closed because the person landing ahead of you neglected to unleash his retractable gear and the airplane has belly burns. That's how accidents happen. Fuel exhaustion accidents are one of general aviation's dark spots. They're needless, pointless, and dangerous. One last word of caution. Be careful what you say to the gas person. Told to top off the tanks, which most pilots take to mean fill her up. The teenage boys, who are usually gas wranglers, have been known to take the tops off the tanks by removing the gas tank caps. With its cap off, a gas tank becomes a fuel dispersal device via the large opening on the top of the wing, where all that nice low pressure says, "Gas, come to me." I've had it happen before. Of course, this should never happen because you will always check the gas quantity, visually after refueling, won't you? Remember Rod Machado's fuel axiom number 13. If you smell fuel on takeoff, go back and land. You probably left the cap off your tank. This is easy to identify on a low-wing airplane. You can generally look out the window and watch a very spectacular plume of $2 plus per gallon fuel going up and out from the wing. On high-wing airplanes, the smell of gas is a good clue. The oil system. If it weren't for engine oil, your engine would run for no more than a few minutes before seizing in a blob of useless metal molecules. Oil creates a thin film that clings to metal surfaces, allowing them to slide over each other with minimal contact. It also acts as a liquid shock absorber, preventing metal parts from banging directly into one another, as well as providing a seal between pistons and cylinders. If that weren't enough, oil also helps clean the internal workings of the crankcase, like a chimney sweep. Metal, carbon, and other impurities are carried on a river of liquid lubricant to the oil filter and removed from circulation. This wonderful fluid also acts as the engine's thermal equalizer. Oil is to an engine as water is to a radiator. Water carries the heat away from the engine, so does oil. This helps keep engine temperatures within acceptable limits. Change of life. Oil is the airplane's lifeline. Renewing it regularly is inexpensive insurance. If you own an airplane, don't be stingy with oil changes. Oil is made up of complex molecules and, like anything that takes a beating, these molecules break down over time. Heat, friction, oxidation, as well as contamination with water, all contribute to making oil a less effective lubricant. Some pilots change their airplane's oil once every 50 hours of flight time. As a young flight instructor with a beat-up automobile, I was always tempted to drain the oil and change the car. Malfunctions in the oil system. I make it a point never to fly one of those super discount airlines. The last time I did, the flight attendant announced it was a no-smoking flight, and the captain had to shut down the right engine. Don't be caught by surprise by disreputable airlines or your airplane. Know how to detect malfunctions in the oil system. Low or fluctuating oil pressure. After engine start, adjust the proper engine speed, usually about 1000 RPM. Then immediately check the oil pressure gauge. The oil pressure needle should point into the green arc within approximately 30 seconds for most airplanes. If it doesn't, shut the engine down. You may have had an oil pump failure, a leak in the line, insufficient oil quantity, oil that's too cold, or even a stuck oil pressure relief valve. A decrease in oil pressure during flight is serious business. The engine's internal cooling capability decreases dramatically with less oil circulating through the engine. What little oil is left in the crankcase must now disperse more of the engine's heat. Because of this, oil temperature should increase with falling oil pressure. If you notice a decrease in oil pressure and the oil temperature doesn't increase, you may have an oil pressure gauge that has failed. If you experience a decrease in oil pressure, I'd recommend heading for the nearest airport. On the way, however, I'd attempt to confirm that oil pressure is actually falling by looking for an increase in oil temperature. If I didn't see it, I'd still find an airport, land, and have the gauge examined. But I'd feel something more akin to urgency than emergency. Low oil temperature. If it's very cold, expect the oil pressure to take a large majority of those 30 seconds to rise. Starts under very cold conditions wreak a lot of havoc. During the time it takes the oil to loosen up and circulate properly, the engine's delicate metal parts are merrily grinding themselves into pixie dust. That's why engines are generally preheated in extreme cold. Lycoming, for example, recommends the engine be preheated at temperatures below 10 degrees Fahrenheit to prevent engine damage during startup. Continental says 20 degrees Fahrenheit. High oil temperature. High oil temperature can result from several causes, one of which is not enough oil within the engine. Excessive engine temperature can cause excessive oil consumption, loss of power, and detonation. It can also damage the engine internally by scoring cylinder walls, damaging the pistons and rings, as well as burning and warping valves. Attempt to cool the engine before the needle moves into the yellow arc of the oil temperature scale. Simply climb at a higher airspeed by lowering the airplane's nose, open the cowl flaps if the airplane is so equipped, or level off for a while, or even descend at lower power settings if engine temperatures don't diminish. High oil pressure. High oil pressure is not without its problems either. Inside most airplane engines is something known as an oil pressure relief valve. This valve provides an alternate path for the flow of oil if the pressure within the system becomes dangerously high. This prevents oil from damaging engine seals with its hydraulic pressures. Once the engine has had a chance to heat up, oil pressure normally decreases. Nevertheless, keep an eye on the pressure. If it's too high, have a mechanic examine the system. The engine cooling system. The power plant, the engine, is also a heat plant. All that local motion results in the production of calories galore, and every bit of the heat is looking for a home. Getting it out of the engine and into the air is one of the jobs that keeps engine and airframe engineers working late at night. Most modern airplane engines are air-cooled. Water cooling may be more efficient, but it would mean carrying considerably more weight, the arch-enemy of lift. Fortunately, there are several routes out of town for engine heat. It can be dissipated by oil coolers, from heated exhaust gas, and from air flowing over the cylinders. Even propeller spinners help cool the engine. Air hitting the spinner is split and efficiently channeled into the engine's cowling, where it flows over the cooling fins. Cylinder fins help cool engines by providing more surface area for heat dissipation. Keep in mind that engine cooling is least effective at high power settings and low airspeed, where a limited amount of air enters the engine cowling. Maintain a good watch of your engine instruments, especially during climbs on hot days. While overheating is damaging, excessive cooling can also shorten engine life. Long or rapid descents under low-power conditions might cause shock cooling of the engine, a condition in which the various metals of the cylinders cool suddenly and at different rates. This can lead to something getting bent out of shape. That can lead to buying expensive new engine parts, so pilots generally have a strong imperative to avoid doing it. Properly planning your descents means you maintain some power to prevent the engine from overcooling. The more power, the better. You want to try keeping the cylinder head temperatures and exhaust gas temperatures from decreasing too quickly. Keeping the cowl flaps closed helps maintain engine temperatures during the descent. By adjusting these flaps with a lever from inside the cockpit, you can regulate engine temperatures. It's like driving your car with a heater on and regulating temperatures by opening or closing the window. Normally, cowl flaps are kept open for climbs to allow for maximum engine cooling. They are usually closed for descents to aid in keeping engine temperatures from dropping too rapidly. Not all airplanes have cowl flaps. They're usually found on airplanes with larger engines, typically having 200 or more horsepower. During a descent, your job is to maintain stable cylinder head temperature, CHT, and oil temperatures. In other words, keep the temperature indications in the green. On some airplanes, gear extension or even partial flap extension at high speeds can be used in lieu of large power reductions to start a descent. Check your pilot's operating handbook. While momentary power reductions aren't as harmful if the power is immediately restored, large ones over long periods can be damaging. Try planning your descents so engine temperatures change slowly from their previous cruise values. The propeller. Propellers come in all sizes and colors, but there are two basic types: fixed pitch and constant speed. In an aeroplane with a fixed pitch prop, one lever, the throttle, controls both power and propeller blade RPM, revolutions per minute. In a constant speed prop, there are separate controls for power and RPM. When you start your flight training, you'll probably fly an airplane with a fixed-pitch propeller. Fixed-pitch propellers have their pitch, angle of attack, fixed during the forging process. The angle is set in stone, well, actually aluminum. This pitch can't be changed except by replacing the propeller, which pretty much prevents you from changing the propeller's pitch in flight. Fixed-pitch props are not ideal for any one thing, yet they're in many ways best for everything. They represent a compromise between the best angle of attack for climb and the best angle for cruise. They are simple to operate and easier, thus less expensive, to maintain. On fixed-pitch propeller airplanes, engine power and engine RPM are both controlled by the throttle. One lever does it all. Power equals RPM, and that's the end. As you move up into higher performance airplanes, however, you'll soon encounter constant speed, controllable pitch propellers. Aeroplanes with these propellers usually have both a throttle and a propeller control, so you can manage engine power and propeller RPM separately. On aeroplanes with constant speed propellers, movement of the throttle determines the amount of fuel and air reaching the cylinders. Simply stated, the throttle determines how much power the engine can develop. Movement of the propeller control changes the propeller's pitch, its angle of attack. This directly controls how fast the propeller rotates, its speed or RPM. While throttle determines engine power, propeller pitch determines how efficiently that power is used. Let's examine how the controllable propeller works. Then we'll examine why changing the propeller's pitch is useful. Forward movement of the propeller control causes both halves of the propeller to rotate about their axes and attack the wind at a smaller angle. In other words, take a smaller bite of air. From aerodynamics, you know that a smaller angle of attack means less drag and less resistance to forward motion. Therefore, moving the propeller control forward increases propeller RPM. Pulling the propeller control rearward causes the propeller to attack the wind at a larger angle of attack, in other words, take a larger bite of air. Since the tachometer tells you how fast the propeller spins, in RPM, is there a gauge to tell you how much throttle is applied? Yes. It's called a manifold pressure gauge, and it gives you an approximate measure of engine power. At the beginning of this chapter, we said a vacuum is created in the induction system as a result of pistons descending on their intake strokes. With the throttle closed, the throttle valve in the induction system prevents air, thus fuel, from rushing into the cylinders and powering the engine. But what is it that forces air into the induction system in the first place? Yes, it's the pressure of the surrounding atmosphere. Because atmospheric pressure is higher than the pressure within the induction system, air flows into the cylinders. Simply stated, the atmosphere wants to push air into the induction system toward the suction created by the downward moving pistons. The amount of this push is measured by the manifold pressure gauge. The gauge is nothing more than a barometric measuring device calibrated to read pressure in inches of mercury, just like altimeters, which we'll discuss in Chapter 5. Manifold pressure is measured downstream of the throttle valve. When the throttle is closed, air outside the engine, under higher atmospheric pressure, can't flow into the induction system, despite the vacuum on the engine side of the throttle valve. The engine is sucking as hard as it can, but the outside air can't get past the closed throttle valve. Opening the throttle slightly causes an increase in manifold pressure. More air and fuel is drawn inside the engine and power increases. Eventually, as the throttle is fully opened, the pressure downstream of the throttle valve approaches that of the atmosphere. In other words, the air is being forced into the induction system at the maximum pressure the atmosphere is capable of pushing. Under normal conditions, the engine's manifold pressure can't rise above atmospheric pressure. Why? The atmosphere can only push an amount equal to how much it weighs. At sea level, atmospheric pressure weighs enough to push a column of mercury 30 inches into a glass tube containing a vacuum. As a measurement of the atmosphere's weight, we say that the outside air pressure is 30 inches of mercury. Therefore, the engine's manifold pressure at full throttle is a little less than 30 inches. It's a little less because of air friction and intake restrictions within the induction system. Clearly then, manifold pressures near 30 inches of mercury signifies more engine power is being developed by the engine. On the other hand, low manifold pressures, say 15 inches or so, indicate less fuel and airs entering the cylinders and less power is being produced. As the airplane climbs, you'll notice the manifold pressure decreases even when the throttle is fully opened. Why? Atmospheric pressure decreases as you ascend. It decreases approximately 1 inch of mercury for every 1,000 feet of altitude gain, and increases approximately 1 inch of mercury for every 1,000 feet of altitude loss. At sea level, you can develop approximately 30 inches of manifold pressure with full throttle. At 5,000 feet MSL, however, your manifold pressure will be approximately 25 inches with full throttle. Remember, under normal conditions, the atmosphere can't force air into the induction system at more than its own pressure. In other words, its own weight. I mentioned that engine power is controlled by the throttle. That's basically true, but engine power can also be varied slightly by the RPM you've selected. In other words, the total power produced by the engine is really a combination of both manifold pressure and engine RPM. Think of it this way. You're on a 2,000 calorie diet. You can eat 1,500 calories for breakfast, 500 for lunch, and skip dinner. 1,000 for breakfast, and 500 for each lunch and dinner. There are lots of combinations that will yield 2,000 calories. The same is true on a constant speed prop plane. Different combinations of manifold pressure and engine RPM can be used to attain a given power setting. In the performance section of your pilot's operating handbook, you can reference power setting performance charts for specific altitudes. There will be multiple combinations of RPM and manifold pressure for you to reference. Any of the manifold pressure and engine RPM combinations listed can be selected to obtain the desired engine power output. The throttle selects the desired manifold pressure, and the propeller control selects engine RPM. Why would you want so many combinations of manifold pressure and RPM? The reason is that fuel consumption, airspeed, and the percent of power produced all vary based on different combinations of manifold pressure and RPM. Noise levels and smoothness of engine operation also vary based on RPM. Even some of your airborne electronic equipment can be affected by engine speed. At least you have a choice among different combinations for power selection. The big question is, why have a propeller that can change its pitch in flight in the first place? After all, this is just another airplane knob you have to contend with, isn't it? Yes, it is, but it's worth the trouble. Aeroplanes having constant speed propellers are much more versatile in their operation. For instance, fixed-pitch propeller airplanes have their propellers permanently configured, pitched, for either a fast cruise or a fast climb, or somewhere in between. You can't change their pitch in flight. Aeroplanes with controllable pitch propellers, however, can essentially reshape the prop by changing its pitch from within. The optimum angle of attack can be used for climb and cruise. Let's take a look at how a different pitch may result in increased performance. Low pitch and high RPMs. When climbing a very steep hill in a car, you want your automobile's engine to develop nearly 100% of its maximum power. That's why you start off in low gear. Low gear results in high engine RPM, thus more engine power being transferred to the wheels. As a result, your car is less likely to bog down during the climb. Pay attention the next time you walk up a steep hill. You'll find yourself using lots of short steps, high RPM, instead of the long strides you'll use on the flatlands. The same philosophy applies to airplanes. During a climb, we want the airplane's engine to develop maximum power. This allows maximum thrust to be produced. Remember, it's excess thrust that allows an airplane to climb. Engine power is dependent on its RPM. For an engine to develop its maximum power, it must be operated at its highest allowable RPM. At any lower RPM, the engine develops only a fraction of its total horsepower. That's why on takeoff, we want the propeller set to its lowest pitch, highest RPM position, which is full forward on the prop lever. In this position, the prop experiences less wind resistance, resulting in less drag and higher engine RPMs. Under these conditions, the engine develops maximum power, thus maximum thrust for climbing and accelerating. You may be thinking, how can the propeller deliver maximum thrust if it doesn't take a big bite of air? Think of it this way. If the propeller does take a big bite of air, a large angle of attack, it will surely develop more thrust, but only if the propeller continues to turn over at a high speed. That's the problem. Taking such a large bite of air increases the propeller's drag, just like a wing at a large angle of attack. This decreases the propeller's speed and prevents the engine from developing its maximum horsepower. It bogs down like the car. The final result is that the propeller produces less thrust than it's capable of producing. One last way of conceptualizing this is to think about a blender. If you don't have one, simply send out a few wedding invitations. If hard vegetable fiber is dropped in before the blades have a chance to spin up, the machine bogs down, RPMs stay low. Nothing gets chopped because the motor has less spinning force or torque at slower speeds. However, once the blender's blades spin up to a fast speed, nothing seems to resist the spinning force of the blades. High motor RPMs mean maximum power is developed, and the blender's blades resist slowing when they encounter thick vegetable fiber. The net result of higher engine RPMs for the aeroplane is that maximum engine thrust is produced when the propeller spins faster, even though the blades are at a lower pitch. High pitch and low RPMs. Are there times when you don't need to develop maximum engine power? Yes. For example, if you're on the freeway, your automobile only needs enough power to keep it moving at a reasonable speed, perhaps only 55% to 65% of its maximum power. Anything more than that, and it's red light in the back window time. High gear, low engine RPM, is selected to maintain freeway speeds. High gear means the engine turns over at a lower RPM, thus producing only the horsepower needed to keep the car moving along at an acceptable pace. This is achieved with less fuel consumption than if the car were running flat out. Aeroplanes are operated in a similar manner during cruise flight. There is no need to develop maximum horsepower during cruise flight. Our concern is to obtain a reasonably fast airspeed while keeping the fuel consumption low. After all, we could operate our airplane in cruise flight at full throttle. But why? The larger drag associated with higher speeds would consume enormous amounts of fuel and not allow us to move all that much faster anyway. Remember, total drag increases dramatically at higher airspeeds. Therefore, cruise flight is a trade-off between high airspeed and low fuel consumption. With the proper combination of manifold pressure and engine RPM, you can obtain a reasonably fast airspeed for a given rate of fuel consumption. In cruise flight, we select the desired manifold pressure with the throttle and engine RPM with the propeller control. Now the propeller produces a specific amount of lift, thrust, for a given lower fuel consumption. Why constant speed propellers? Controllable pitch propellers on general aviation airplanes are of the constant speed variety. Once the RPM is established, changes in manifold pressure, by moving the throttle, won't affect engine speed. In other words, opening or closing the throttle or changing the airplane's attitude doesn't vary the engine's RPM. This is why these controllable propellers are given the name constant speed propellers. Of course, if you pull the throttle all the way back, there's simply no power available to keep the propeller spinning. The engine's RPM has no choice but to drop. The reason constant speed propellers are put on an airplane is to reduce a pilot's workload. Instead of having to readjust the RPM with every change in power, you simply set the RPM and it stays where it's put. Just like your home thermostat keeps the temperature constant. What is the value of having a propeller that maintains a preset or constant speed? It provides you with one less item to readjust while managing power. Let's suppose your pilot's operating handbook suggests the most efficient use of engine power during climb occurs at 25 inches of manifold pressure and 2,500 RPM. Pilots refer to this as 25 squared, which proves how weak some of them are in math. As you climb, the manifold pressure decreases approximately 1 inch per 1,000 feet. because the outside air pressure decreases 1 inch for every 1,000 feet altitude gain. Since you have a constant speed propeller, the RPM automatically stays set at 2,500, despite variations in manifold pressure or throttle positions. All you need to do is keep adding throttle to maintain the desired manifold pressure during the climb. The RPM needs no adjusting. How to make power changes. With the ability to vary propeller pitch, you need to understand a few very important principles about power management. It's relatively easy to overstress an engine if the throttle and propeller controls aren't used in the proper order during power changes. For instance, suppose your manifold pressure and RPM are set at 23 inches and 2,300 RPM. You want to increase the manifold pressure and RPM to 25 inches and 2,500 RPM. If you increase the manifold pressure to 25 inches first, it will increase the combustible mixture flowing into the cylinders. This would normally spin the propeller faster. Yet this doesn't happen, since the propeller takes a bigger bite of air to absorb the increase in power. Cylinder stress increases, and the propeller keeps the RPM from increasing. In other words, the expanding gases push harder, yet are unable to move the pistons faster. Given enough cylinder stress, you could damage the engine. When you want to increase both the manifold pressure and RPM, change the RPM first, then increase the manifold pressure. In other words, move the propeller control forward first, the throttle next. Follow the same philosophy when decreasing manifold pressure and RPM. Pull the throttle back first, followed by the propeller control. Another way of thinking about this is to keep the propeller control lever physically ahead of the throttle during all manifold pressure and RPM changes. A memory aid for this is to keep the prop on top, or always in front of the throttle. Propeller tips and ideas. Be aware that the propeller governor starts working only when the engine is operating above a specific RPM and not below. In other words, moving the throttle will change the RPM until the propeller reaches its minimum governing RPM. This is why the magneto check we discussed earlier is performed below this minimum governing RPM. Remember, we're interested in seeing how much of an RPM drop occurs on each mag, as well as between the mags. Magneto checks done at higher RPMs wouldn't show any mag drops on the tachometer, since the propeller would vary its pitch to maintain a specific RPM. On complex high-performance airplanes, those with retractable landing gear and constant speed propellers, we use a verbal checklist while on final approach to land. It's the acronym GUMP, or GUMP. It stands for gas, fuel pump on, undercarriage, gear down, mixture, full in, and prop, propeller control full forward. Why is the propeller control put in the full forward, low pitch, high RPM position just before landing? We do so in the unlikely event there's a need to go around. A go-around is an aborted landing. You apply full power, climb out, and go around for another attempt at landing. In this situation, it's important that the engine develop full power, just like on takeoff. That's why the propeller control is moved to the full forward position, exactly where it is during takeoff. Up, up, and away. You now know the basics of what makes an aeroplane engine tick, kick, heat, and freeze. As I said at the beginning of this chapter, you don't have to be a wrench jockey to be a good pilot. But now, you do have some vital information under your seatbelt, information that can help you fly safely and economically. Enjoy it. Post-flight briefing number 3-1, detonation and pre-ignition. Detonation. Heat is something a pilot should pay close attention to. This was apparent to me even before I started flying. My grandparents smoked like crazy when I was a kid. I would feel their bedroom door. If it was hot, I knew they were still up, puffing away. On their cigarettes, you understand. If you want to avoid engine-damaging problems from excess heat, you'll need to learn something about detonation. The cylinder's fuel-air charge expands as it's ignited by the spark plugs. Properly done, this isn't an explosion so much as it is a smooth, progressive burning of the combustible gases within the cylinder. As these gases expand, they increase pressure, pushing the piston downward during its power stroke. Detonation occurs when the fuel-air charge explodes, burning in a short, fierce burst of energy rather than a controlled, even burn. Such an explosion can be very damaging and sometimes fatal to the aeroplane engine. Detonation occurs after the spark plug fires, when the unburned portion of the fuel-air charge, ahead of the burning charge, suddenly explodes.
If you can imagine being kicked by a kung fu master from Wong's Chinese bulletproof buffet takeout, you might appreciate how damaging detonation can be to an engine. One kung fu kick could damage the body, as continued explosions damage the piston, cylinder, and valves.
High engine and cylinder head temperatures increase the likelihood of detonation. They may aid in the abnormal exploding versus the normal burning of the ignitable gases within the cylinder. As an interesting note, the EGT reading actually decreases during detonation, while the cylinder head temperature increases. Why? With the exploding of the cylinder's fuel-air charge, combustion takes place earlier. This suddenly and dramatically releases the heat from the combustion process to the cylinder, piston, and valves. Too much heat at one time. That's the problem. The exhaust gases that are released have already expended their heat. They're cooler, which is reflected in a lower EGT reading. If the throttle and mixture aren't moved, and you see the EGT decrease while cylinder head temperatures increase, suspect detonation. Do whatever you need to do to cool the engine. If you suspect detonation, there are several ways you can cool the engine cylinders. First, enrich the mixture. Second, lower the climb angle, improving airflow over the cylinders. Third, if the airplane has cowl flaps, open them. Finally, reducing power is always a good practice if detonation is suspected. Do what you need to do to reduce those cylinder head temperatures. The following are several known causes of detonation. 1. Using a lower grade of fuel than what is recommended by the manufacturer. Higher octane fuels have additives which help them prevent detonation. 2. Using time-expired fuel. 3. Over-leaning. Excessive leaning can raise cylinder head temperatures, increasing the likelihood of fuel exploding instead of burning within the cylinders. 4. Overheating an engine by climbing too steeply on hot days, as well as using excessive engine power. Some engines have restrictions on the time maximum power can be used. 5. An abrupt opening of the throttle. Pre-ignition. Pre-ignition isn't the ability to see sparks from the future. Pre-ignition is ignition occurring before the spark plug ignites the cylinder's fuel-air charge. It's very different from detonation, which is an explosion within the cylinders. Pre-ignition causes peak pressures within the cylinder to occur before the beginning of the power cycle. It is usually caused by a hot spot in the cylinders. This hot spot acts like a little spark plug, setting off the fuel-air charge prematurely. Glowing deposits of lead in the cylinders, overheated spark plugs, or using high power settings with lean mixtures can all lead to hotspot formation and pre-ignition. Pre-ignition is by no means benign. It can cause a rough-running engine, possible backfiring, a sudden rise in engine temperatures, and possible engine damage, like piston or rod failure. Be alert for any of these signs and be prepared to reduce the temperature of the engine as recommended in the case of detonation. Post-flight briefing number 3-2. Fuel injection systems. Fuel injection is a process in which fuel is directly metered and distributed to each cylinder without the use of a carburetor. A carburetor provides fuel for all the cylinders. A fuel injection system allows a precise amount of fuel to be delivered to each cylinder individually via the fuel discharge nozzles. These discharge nozzles squirt fuel under high pressure into the cylinder's intake ports near the intake valves. Better fuel distribution, more accurate fuel-air mixture to each cylinder, results from fuel injection compared to a typical carburation system. The FCU, Fuel Control Unit, regulates both the volume of airflow entering the engine and the quantity of fuel delivered to the FMU, Fuel Manifold Unit. Movement of the throttle varies the position of the throttle valve, which regulates the amount of air flowing over the venturi, much like that found in a typical carburetor. A small tube from the FCU samples the amount of airflow over the venturi and, based on the volume of incoming air, regulates the amount of fuel flowing to the FMU. This allows the FMU to maintain a specific fuel-air ratio in each cylinder. No vaporization of fuel occurs within the induction system. This means that a fuel injection system isn't subject to the refrigerator-like problems associated with most air and vaporizing fuel. You can't get carburetor ice in a fuel injection system for one very important reason. There's no carburetor. Fuel injection, however, isn't completely invulnerable to the effects of Mother Nature. Impact ice, mentioned earlier, is the Achilles heel of fuel injection. Anything that plugs the air intake port will suffocate the engine. Fortunately, many fuel-injected engines have something known as an alternate air lever located in the cockpit. Activating the alternate air lever allows the engine to draw air from an unobstructed source within the cowling. Some airplanes with fuel injection have a suck-open alternate air door in lieu of a manually activated lever. This is a spring or magnet-held opening in the induction system. In the event the primary air source becomes plugged, the engine's sucking action automatically opens an alternate air door. Despite blockage of the primary air source, the engine still continues to run. Most larger airplanes with bigger engines use fuel injection. The proper distribution of fuel becomes an important factor when larger, heat-producing engines could be easily damaged from improper distribution of fuel within the cylinders. Here are some of the advantages and disadvantages of fuel injection. Advantages of fuel injection. 1. Improved control of fuel-air ratio. 2. More uniform delivery of the fuel-air mixture to each cylinder. 3. Increased engine efficiency. 4. Freedom from vaporization ice, otherwise known as fuel ice. 5. Instant acceleration of engine without tendency to hesitate. Disadvantages of fuel injection. 1. Contamination of dirt and water can more easily affect fuel-injected engines due to the small orifices of injector nozzles. 2. Difficulty starting engines on hot days due to vapor lock. 3. Any surplus fuel could be routed to one tank and cause a fuel imbalance if the pilot is not familiar with the fuel system. Post-flight briefing number 3-3. Advanced Aeroplane Systems. Turbocharging. Humans, like aeroplanes, find their performance is best at sea level. Why? The air is more dense. It's as simple as that. Decrease the air density, and performance decreases. On one occasion, I was flying at 17,500 feet MSL with 4 people aboard a Cessna 210. It wasn't a pressurized version, so we were all wearing our oxygen masks.
Dude, check it out. One of the passengers was fiddling with his mask and accidentally disconnected his tube without even realizing it. As they conversed with one another, the dude started to sound pretty weird. In fact, he started to sound like he was a few fries short of a Happy Meal. Whoa. He was experiencing hypoxia, or lack of oxygen, dude. Rod hooked him back up, and his mental performance, his IQ, returned to normal, like high level. Sweet.
With sufficiently dense air, the engine's performance will also remain at higher levels. At sea level, where atmospheric pressure is high, maximum manifold pressure is obtained for takeoff. As the airplane ascends, less atmospheric pressure is available to push air into the engine's cylinders. Airplanes with turbochargers, however, are able to produce sea-level power at higher altitudes. Turbocharging compresses air into the intake manifold by utilizing the normally unused exhaust gases exiting the engine. Exhaust gases are put to use in spinning a turbine which, in turn, is connected to the end of an air compressor. The speed of the compressor is controlled by automatically or manually adjusting the flow of exhaust gases over the turbine. This is done by something known as a wastegate. When no turbocharging is needed, a wastegate valve is opened, allowing hot, pressurized exhaust gases to escape and bypass the turbine. As manifold pressures decrease with altitude gain, turbocharging becomes useful. The wastegate valve closes either automatically or manually depending on your aeroplane, allowing more exhaust to flow over the turbine. This spins the compressor, allowing compressed air to be pumped into the induction system. Larger manifold pressures are now possible at higher altitudes. More of the engine's maximum obtainable power is now available at these altitudes. Most airplanes have automatic wastegate controllers, which allow a specific manifold pressure set by the pilot to be maintained. These automatic systems can also prevent overboosting of the engine by automatically opening the wastegate valve in the event of excessive manifold pressure. Overboosting the engine can cause excessive combustion pressures in cylinders and damage the engine. On some airplanes, the pilot must manually control the wastegate through a lever in the cockpit. When flying an airplane with manual turbocharging, be careful to avoid taking off with the wastegate lever in the full turbocharged position. With application of full throttle, you could cause some pretty severe engine damage. Without turbocharging, small airplanes typically have a service ceiling of approximately 15,000 feet. A service ceiling is an altitude above which the aircraft will not climb. However, operational altitudes in excess of 25,000 feet are not uncommon in turbocharged, piston-powered airplanes. But turbocharging is not without its price. Compressing air increases its temperature. Turbocharging adds heat to an already heated engine. Turbocharged engines are asked to operate at the outer limits of endurance, and there is little margin for pilot indiscretion or inattention. Pilots of turbocharged aircraft need to be especially cognizant of engine operating temperatures. In fact, some airplane manufacturers recommend their turbocharged airplanes be operated at extra-rich mixtures to help keep the engine cooler. To help prevent heat-related problems, some airplanes with turbochargers have air cooling systems called intercoolers. Intercoolers cool the air that's leaving the air compressor before it enters the upper portion of the induction system. Pressurization. I never cease to be amazed at the inventions of modern man. Some are an inconvenience, and some are very practical. For instance, telephones once came with their own leash. It was almost impossible to misplace one. When I purchased a cellular phone, I lost it the first week. I had to call myself to find out where I left it. It's a great invention, but it also produces a lot of frustration. Pressurization for airplanes, however, is an excellent idea. Pressurizing an airplane allows you to fly at very high altitudes while remaining in a cabin environment with near sea level pressures. This is accomplished by directing compressed air from the turbocharger or from an auxiliary compressor into the cabin. Flight at higher altitudes is now possible while maintaining the cabin at pressures found at much lower elevations. For instance, one general aviation airplane model can fly at 25,000 feet while pressurizing the cabin to 8,000 feet. Essentially, you feel like you are breathing the air at an altitude of 8,000 feet as you are swooping along at 25,000 feet. It is a common misconception that pressurization places the cabin at sea level pressure. This is important to understand because people with certain medical conditions cannot stand higher elevations for long, if at all. The fuselage of a pressurized aircraft is built stronger, allowing it to withstand the forces of pressurization. The next time you're walking around the airport, try and guess which aircraft are pressurized. Little, round windows are usually the telltale clue identifying pressurized airplanes. These windows are more capable of handling the high internal cockpit air pressures associated with pressurizations. Pressurized airplanes also have airtight seals on all doors and baggage compartments. Pressurization would be impossible if air could easily escape around and outdoors, vents, and windows. Pilots control aircraft pressurization by means of a dial known as the cabin altitude controller, located in the cockpit. In the hands of an inept operator, this can become an instrument of torture, wreaking havoc on innocent eardrums. Easy does it is the operative thought here. By rotating the dial, the pilot informs the pressurization system of the exact amount of pressure needed in the aircraft. Air from the compressor, also known as bleed air, is then pumped into the cockpit for pressurization. The cabin altitude controller also operates an outflow valve. When the outflow valve is nearly closed, the cabin becomes pressurized. An open outflow valve allows air to escape, depressurizing the cabin. Pressurized airplanes have a limit on the amount of internal pressure they can withstand. There comes a point where the difference between the low-pressure air outside and high-pressure air inside the cabin becomes too great. It's like overinflating a balloon. Too much pressure on the inside can cause it to pop. To prevent this, a limit known as the maximum cabin differential pressure is established. Fortunately, a pressure release safety valve prevents excessive cabin pressures. At this time, it is suggested that you review the illustrations and photographs contained in Chapter 3 of Rod Machado's Private Pilot Handbook.